My name is Samantha Hall-Saladino. I am the Fulton County Historian and the Executive Director at the Fulton County Historical Society. Back in the mid to late 19th century, 90% of the world's gloves came from Fulton County, specifically Gloversville and Johnstown, but also the surrounding communities and rural areas contributed to the industry in many different ways. And one of the most important workforces in the glove industry were women. The industry started really after the American Revolution in the early 1800s. We don't know who exactly started it. There are a few names that get thrown around, but one of them is a man named Talmadge Edwards, and he came to New York from England. He was trained in the art of leather dressing. And through Dutchess County, he came to Johnstown and purchased a house, and he set up a shed in the back of his house where he started a very small glove operation. And right away, women were included in this. He hired farm girls to come and cut the leather into the gloves, which were in reality more mittens. They were not the refined leather gloves that we think of today. These were definitely more hardy mittens used for outdoor work, farming. Frontiersmen used them quite a lot. So he would hire these farm girls to come and cut the leather and then send the pieces home to the farmers' wives to sew. So already a system is being set up of work outside the home and work inside the home. And this is really where the cottage industry in the glove industry began. So there was always a tradition of women working with the gloves and with the leather, both in the factories and at home. The glove industry brought a huge wave of immigrants to Fulton County. In the mid to late 1800s, we see German Jewish immigrants settling here. Nathan Littauer was the first Jewish settler in Gloversville, and his son, Lucius, was the first Jewish baby born in Gloversville. He became a very wealthy man in the glove industry, and he was always a longtime supporter of the city. He donated thousands and thousands of dollars for various projects, including our hospital, which is still called the Nathan Littauer Hospital today, after his father. So that was the first wave of immigrants coming specifically for the glove industry. Nathan Littauer began reaching out to contacts back home, neighbors, friends, family back in Germany, and encouraging them to come to Fulton County and work for him or in other jobs in the glove industry. And so once that wave started, everybody started to hear about the opportunities that were available in Fulton County for work. A later wave of Jewish immigrants were coming from Eastern Europe, specifically Russia and Poland, and they were settling here as well and working in the industry. In fact, one of the most famous early settlers here during that time was Samuel Goldfish, who we may know better today as Samuel Goldwyn of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer fame, MGM. He started out sweeping floors in a glove factory, worked his way up to become a salesman, and eventually left New York for Hollywood, where, as they say, the rest is history. We also see people coming from Italy, France, England, all over Europe coming to Fulton County to work in the industry. And a lot of times these folks had backgrounds in this fine craftsmanship. This was something that was being done for years and years over in Europe before the industry started in Gloversville. So they were coming with very fine craftsmanship and found jobs in the glove factories. Women very rarely did anything other than sew on gloves in the early years.
Good morning. I'm Beth Barker Potter, originally from Mayfield, New York, currently living in Johnstown, New York. I have an interesting family story related to glove making and the leather industry in Fulton County. My grandmother, Pearl Brownell Barker, born in the very latter part of the 1800s, was one of four sisters, and her father insisted they all quit school at 14 and start sewing on gloves at home. So she did. Didn't have a choice, so she did. She and her sisters then all married. She married my grandfather at 18 and sewed at home. She was very quick, very dexterous, and often got the fancy, what they called the fancy work, which paid more per dozen. When my father came along, she worked from home, as a lot of the women did. It was a seasonal job in truth, because often the mills closed in the summer heat, so there were no hides to be cut and no gloves to be sewn. So that was, that was a pleasant reprieve for her. But she liked sewing on the gloves and being with all the ladies in the glove shops. They were hardworking women, and this was their social life as well as making a living. My father was her only child. My grandfather, unfortunately, was a pretty serious alcoholic. When he did work, he worked well, but he wasn't always dependable. So she was the breadwinner often, majority of the time, I'd say. And she liked that. I think she was a woman way ahead of her time. She, at one point, the glove delivery guy was a friend of hers, and he asked her if she could watch his toddler son, whose mother had passed, while she was sewing on the gloves. Oh, no big ask there. She did it until he could start school. So she, in essence, had a second son, but not of her own. She sewed on the gloves until she was late 60s, early 70s. I can close my eyes and visualize all these ladies. They'd walk to the glove shop, they'd walk back at lunchtime, make lunch, walk back again, and stroll home at 3 or 4 o'clock, laughing and talking. It was like birds. You could hear them. It was a delightful way to grow up. It's lost now. But I'm glad that I had that experience and that I was able to know who was in each glove shop, who worked on what table, which owner to avoid because he didn't like kids on the floor, as they called it, which is understandable now, but not then, because they had candy in a drawer, and that's what I was after. But I knew most of them, so they didn't squeal on me. Lots of families worked there, her sisters, her cousins. So it was a family affair in lots of ways. And they were respected. They were respected by the glove shop owners because they knew exactly whose work was whose by the quality. And hers was often the sought-after one. And she was proud of that too. But she was putting food on the table, and that was the whole motive.
So I'm going to share the story of my grandmother, and her name is Conchetta. She was called Jenny, as it was Americanized. Conchetta Catherine Papa, who was born in Naples, Italy on March 3rd of 1886. And she died in Gloversville on in May 21st, in 1946. My grandmother, Jenny, as called by her family, was one of those women who sewed gloves at home. And she did so because there were 5 children to take care of. And so this was something that she could do at home to supplement the family income. My grandfather, Alfred Evangelista, was a table cutter. And the table cutters were supposedly the artisans of the glove trade because they had to know how to use the leather that was stretched, what parts to cut. And of course, they cut gloves then to specific sizes, which they, today it's small, medium, large, right? I'm sure you can get custom cut gloves, but in those days, in the 20th century, when so many people wore gloves, that's the way my grandfather worked. So meanwhile, his wife Jenny worked at home with the kids, and the kids used to come in from school. And of course, when they were little, they were home. And so she liked it because she could get up and cook. She had her sewing machine in the kitchen. She could get up and stir the pot. In fact, my mother used to say to her, "Mom, when are you going to teach me to cook?" And my grandmother apparently used to say, "Oh, sweetheart, cooking's the easiest thing in the world. I really need you and your sister Irma to clean for me, do the floors, because I can't get up off this machine." So she worked piecework, which most people know you get paid for how much you produce in a particular time. And the company apparently dropped off the gloves to be done and picked them up whenever the appointed time was. And a new load came for you to work on. So that's what she did. And she certainly wasn't one that anyone reported ever complaining about her lot in life, and liked being home with her children. So obviously, the money that she earned would have been essential to the household with that many children. And my grandmother and grandfather, Alfred Evangelista, made it a point to be sure that their children finished high school. That was very important to them. They were very well read themselves. They had been educated in Italy. My grandfather's family came so that they could keep the sons out of the Italian army. So they didn't come here. They had trades back home. They had not a reason to leave except for political reasons in Europe. And so they were very intent on education. And their children all did graduate high school. Unfortunately, they grew up during the Depression, and so there weren't opportunities for them to go to school beyond high school.
Hello, I'm Connie Duras Chamberlain, and I'm very glad to share the story of my family as they worked in the glove industry, and there were several of them that did. The first one, and the starting one, was my grandmother, Eva Seeley Bostwick. She was born and brought up in Broadalbin and moved to Johnstown when she got married. She only had an 8th grade education, so she would work for various glove factories in the area. But after she got married and had her first child in 1920, then she stayed at home. They allowed her to do piecework at home. She did glove linings, and it was 50 cents a pair that she was paid. When she did her glove work at home, she would have to do so many pair a day to keep food on the table. When she became pregnant 3 years later with her second child, her husband said, "If all you're going to do is have children, then I'm leaving," and he left. So she went into survival mode, and by her glove making, she was able to keep food on the table. She worked for Gates Mills Glove Company, and Mr. Gates, her employer, also helped her buy a home. So she had a home mortgage and her 2 children to feed, her 2 daughters. So she was able to do this with her piecework at home, with her Singer sewing machine with a trundle at the bottom, and it wasn't electrified. So she would do that all day long, and then in the evening she would have her gardens to put more food on the table. So she's kind of our role model for all of us. She was a survivor, and she was definitely dedicated to her family, and she was very determined and proud. She says, "We may be poor, but we're not dirty. We have clothes, we have food, we have a roof over our heads." So she was a very strong worker, and she worked doing gloves like that, doing glove liners for over 50 years. She worked until she was 65 from her teens. In 1920, my mother was born, Nina Seeley, and Bostwick, and she also became a glove worker after her graduation. So it was in the early 1940s that she worked at Swears Glove Company. And they did a picture of a few of the women that worked at Swears, and in the front is my mother. This was taken in 1956, but she started working in the 1940s. She didn't do the liners, she did the gloves themselves, and worked with, usually it was a room of about 30 women that would be working. She had a brief break from the glove industry in the mid-40s when her husband was in the Navy, and she went to California. And there she worked for a while as an apprentice to a tailor, where she learned a lot. Coming back, she continued at Swear's Glove Shop and worked there until her mid-60s.
Homework was an important part of our community and its culture. Homework being just what it sounds like, work that was done at home. Factories would hire women to sew gloves at their own homes. They would either rent or buy sewing machines. And there was a Singer sewing machine office in downtown Johnstown and Gloversville where women could go and ensure that their machines were being repaired. There's a great story how women who did homework would often accompany their machines to be repaired or to be serviced because they wanted to make sure that everything was being done properly, right? This was their connection to their livelihood. So they would sew at home. The factories would drop pieces off to the women, and they would sew them wherever they could in their kitchens. Very rarely did they have a room dedicated to doing this work. It was wherever they could find. And once the pieces were completed, the factory would come and pick them back up, and the women would be paid by piece. So however many pieces you sewed was what you would be paid. Oftentimes, children were roped into helping, either by learning how to operate the sewing machine. So, for example, if mom had to stop her work to prepare supper, a child who was old enough and who knew how could step in and continue sewing so that the income during that time wouldn't be lost. There are some women who were doing jobs that were not considered traditional in the glove and leather industry. A lot of times we see women mostly doing sewing because this was considered women's work. This was a needle craft, but it was a very important part of the industry, obviously. We see women making strides and pioneering into other areas of the industry as well. Teresa Ottolagano, for example, was one of the first women to work on the tannery floor. She earned the nickname Tessie the Tanner. Teresa was a member of the union, the Leather Workers Union, and she moved her way up in that company. She only took one day off, they said in a newspaper, and she did a newspaper interview, and she only ever took one day off when her son was born. So she was very dedicated to her work. And in a common thread, in a common story, she was able to do this, to work in the factory, because her husband worked opposite shifts. So she would work during the daytime when her husband was home, and then he would work evenings at General Electric in Schenectady. So because they were able to alternate their schedules, there was always somebody there to take care of the children. For home workers, childcare was a big issue. So they were still able to help contribute to their family's economy, but still stay home and fulfill, their expected motherly duties by raising their children and being there to take care of the housework and things that needed to be done around the house. But homework was not just for married women. There were lots of other people who benefited from this system. Elderly women who did not have as much mobility, for example, could work at home and support themselves if necessary, or contribute to a family's income. Those who were physically unable to do labor in a factory could work at home as well. And this was also helpful for rural families, because if there was not a glove factory close enough where they could drive or walk or transport there in some other way every day, they could still sew at home because the factory would come and bring those pieces to them. It was also a benefit for the factory because it helped to lower their overhead costs. So they were not paying for the electric to run all of these sewing machines, to have all of these extra employees on site, and so it also was a benefit for them. As early as the 1930s, we start to see this argument for the ban on homework.
I'm Dee Brown, and I am the mother-in-law of Nancy, who was interviewing me about my mother. My mother sewed gloves or mittens, one or the other, and they must have been knit. And she had a sewing machine, a special sewing machine in the corner in our kitchen. And I can remember her sewing those mittens or gloves, and when she finished a whole batch of them, she would put them in a little red wagon. This was during World War II. We had one car, and my father worked in Gloversville. So my mother would take the gloves, the finished product, and bring them up to Scott's Moore's glove shop, which was on the corner of North Market and Green Street, right across from the Colonial Cemetery. Then she must have picked up some more things to work on and brought them back home and sewed on the gloves or mittens, whichever they were. I cannot remember which they were, but this was her job. And there were many women who did this in Johnstown. It was like a cottage industry here for a while. Mm-hmm. My mother's parents came from Czechoslovakia at the turn of the century. And when she started kindergarten, she could not speak very much English, but she became very, very, very good with her grammar. Well, she was in the kitchen, and she was a good housekeeper, so the working conditions were what she would dictate. She sewed when she could, and that was it.
My name is Barbara Taylor, and I'm going to tell you a story about my grandmother. My paternal grandmother, her name was Justina Hessick. Well, my grandmother and grandfather bought a dairy farm, a small dairy farm. They had 3 children, a boy, a girl, and then another boy who, the baby, was my dad. And the farm was out in Perth, where the Tryon Boys School is now. So it was 7 miles maybe outside the city. And I don't think my grandfather was too ambitious. And I know when my father and his brother got older, they had to milk the cows and bring the milk in to the city to be distributed and go home and then go to school twice a day. So my grandmother, I think, heard about a way to make some extra money and still be at home, because I'm sure she was helping out on the farm. And she told me the story of my dad, who was about 5 years old, and he had learned to read. And at night after dinner, and her chores were done, she had a treadle sewing machine in a corner of her kitchen, and she would sit and she would sew gloves. I think she was a thumb sewer on the gloves, and she got paid for the amount of thumbs that she sewed. So whenever she could, she would sit down, and my father used to like to read to her, and he'd read his favorite book. His favorite book was about a little bird who fell out of the nest, and nobody was able to save the bird, and the bird died. And my father would cry, and my grandmother would cry, and he told my grandmother that he decided he was going to go to college and be a doctor when he grew up so that he could help people, because he didn't like the idea that nobody could help the bird. And my father did do that. He was the only educated person out of the 3 siblings, and he had to go very sparingly to Syracuse University. He had to hitchhike his way there and stay there. And he became a doctor and a surgeon, and he returned to Johnstown. And she told me that story quite a bit. Mm-hmm. My father was Dr. Hessick. He was doctor here. He was a family practitioner for 40-some years, a surgeon. He was a coroner. He took care of all the athletic teams in Johnstown, from the professional ones to the semi-pros to the high school.
And all that from reading a story while his mom was sewing gloves.
Was sewing gloves.
This is a time when we see a lot of labor reform, especially in our laws at the federal level. A lot of protections for workers. Of course, child labor was a huge issue in our early industrial history. Oddly enough, it was never really an issue here, even though children could conceivably be helping their mothers work at home. But Gloversville, Johnstown, the people who lived in Fulton County saw this as almost an attack on a way of life for them. This was part of the fabric of the community. This was part of our community's culture here in Fulton County. So the general view was that these were people coming in from the outside who did not understand this system, who wanted to get rid of it. And so throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, we see this movement picking up. In the early 1940s, the New York State Department of Labor Industrial Commissioner Frida Miller starts to host a number of public forums around Fulton County, specifically in Gloversville and Johnstown, about the issue of banning homework. This is an opportunity for community members to speak publicly on the record about their view of homework, and we see a lot of women and men stand up in support of this system. There were certainly times when families relied on this opportunity for work when the husband or the father, the man of the house, was out of work or was not making enough money to support the family. The women doing the glove making at home really got them through those times. And Fulton County wasn't as hard hit by the Great Depression either because of this industry and this system. So it really was seen as an attack on community values here in Fulton County. But eventually, Frida Miller passed Order Number 4 in 1941, which officially banned homework on the widespread level that we had seen it. Homework was still available, but there were many more regulations in place. Women had to apply for special permits through factories who were only given a certain number of home workers allowed to work for them, and they had to keep meticulous records of the hours they were working, what they were working on, how many gloves were completed, and they would receive regular visits from these members of the commission who would come and make sure that conditions were clean in the home, that rules were being followed, and that these workers were not being taken advantage of. From what I've seen in historical records of women speaking about this system, it is not something they felt was detrimental to them. They did not feel they were being taken advantage of. But the Order Number 4, the banning of the homework, also increased costs for factories because they were now forced to have labor on site, workers on site. So a lot of the smaller companies who had been operating were not able to keep up with this and unfortunately closed their doors. So we see the closure of a lot of small factories in Fulton County during this time. So because of this, we start to see more women enter the factory environment. They're not working at home so much anymore.
Hello, my name is Ann Bowles. I was born and raised here in Gloversville, and I'm going to tell you the story about my grandmother, and her name was Celestina Rovazini Brzezowski Perry. She worked in the glove industry since she was 16. She was born in 1923, so she started in the 1940s. She worked until she was 90, and some of the places I remember, the last one she worked at was Samco in Gloversville, and also Conroy in Johnstown and Gates Gloves. So her job was a sewer. She sewed an intricate stitch in between the palm and the thumb of the glove. There were not a lot of people able to do this stitch, to the point of when she was in her 80s at Samco, she was starting to have her some ailments in her knees, and her boss put her Singer sewing machine downstairs to the first floor so she could continue working to do that one intricate stitch between the palm and the thumb. So as I grew up, I got to see her work on the floor in the mills, and it's nothing that this generation will ever see. Just the rows of sewing machines, the noise, and the manual labor that went into it. Graham and her colleagues would do this work with a pedal, and also the movement of their hands in the machine. So I believe it was an art for not only Graham but for all the men and women who worked in the factories. The timing of the pedal with her hands and watching that art in motion was quite amazing. I'm just proud to share this story. It's all the stories that you'll hear are a big part of the history here in Gloversville. She was a part of the history. I got to see it with my own eyes. She worked for decades. She was a proud glove maker, proud of her art and the friendships that she made throughout the years. She's an Italian. She is of Italian heritage. Her parents moved here from Italy, but she was born here in Fort Plain. But my aunts were really some of her friends that she made in the glove making industry. So, they were part of my life. They were a big part of her second family and her family, really. And it was just a magical moments to see her make the gloves the way they were in the past. So.
Marguerite Slusher.
And we're in Johnstown, New York today. And Mrs. Slusher, would you tell us about your history in the glove industry?
My mother was a hand sewer, and she had a permit to have gloves delivered to her, and she would fix them at home, sew the fingers. And she taught us children how to do it. There were 3 girls. So we did her share of closing the fingers, but she got the money.
How old were you do you remember when you did that?
I was about 12.
Okay.
And then they stopped having the home permit because I guess they discovered that the parents weren't doing the work, the children were. So then she went to work as a hand knitter. She knitted the gloves, and then next to the knitting machine room, there was a place where it was called the hand sewer's room, and after school I would go there and I would close the fingers on the gloves that were made by my mother.
So tell us how often you did that.
And we did that from every day, Monday through Friday, from 4 to 6, and then we worked Saturday mornings, 8 to 12.
And how old were you when you worked there? Mm-hmm.
I was 14, and then I worked till I was 16.
So after your mom, and can you give us your mom's name?
My mother is Anna Valkovic.
So after she didn't do home sewing anymore, approximately how long did she work in a factory?
She worked until retirement of age for Social Security. And her hours were supposed to be 8 to 5, but my mother went to work at her convenience and sometimes would not go to work till 10. And she would get home from work around 5:30. And by that time, us children had dinner already.
Do you remember how much you were paid when you worked at
I believe it was 35 cents a dozen. But the women were excited when they got army gloves because that was double in price.
And approximately how many other women did your mom work with?
I believe there were around 20 of them. Okay. I would say the majority of them were Slovak.
Were Slovak women. I bet there was a lot of camaraderie.
Yes, there was. There certainly was. And then Leon Swears, who was the owner, he would have a Christmas party for them every year.
And how many other people like yourself worked when you were a young teenager there? Do you remember?
I believe there were around 5 other girls.
And they worked the same kind of thing after
and
school?
And their mothers were also knitters.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else that you want to add? This has been so interesting.
No, it was a wonderful time. And we enjoyed doing it. We were brought up to work.
Well, our thanks to you because you helped build our community.
Well, thank you.
Andrea Fettinger, and I am the director of the Fulton County Office for Aging, and we'll be talking about my grandmother, May Hessick. My grandmother, Mary Ellen Henley Hessick, was born in 1911, and she began her work in the glove industry when she was 14 years old, and it's when her own nuclear family was in the glove business, and she would pick up scraps and do certain things around the sewing machines that were at home. Further on, as she grew and got married, she became a glove sewer and knitter with Gates Mills Gloves. She also was a forewoman at Gates Mills Gloves, which meant that she was part of a union, the Glove Makers Union, and she also was a floor person, so she would supervise all of the glove sewers, and she learned all the different kinds of sewing that you had to do. There were very particular, complicated sewing techniques on leather that she got to learn about and could do really well, and that's why she was promoted during a lot of her years in the glove business.
Do you know how long her workday was?
Her workday was probably 9 hours a day. She was married when she was young. She was probably 19 years old, and she married somebody else who worked in the leather business, and her husband died very young, so that she kept working till she was like 70 years old and was able to keep her income and also got a retirement pension from the union that she was part of at the glove shop. Her parents were immigrants from Kilkenny, Ireland, and they had 4 children, and they were came over with many other Irish immigrants from Kilkenny and County Cork to settle in this part of Johnstown. I think that the important thing to know about her was that she walked to work and back every day, even in the winter. She also lived in a neighborhood where she could walk to the market, and she didn't have to go to a supermarket until she was much older. And she was someone who had a lot of friends in the glove business, not like the owners, but all of the glove makers, so that they had their own camaraderie, and that's how they were successful. That's how they survived kind of the hard working conditions that were early on in her career, and then later on things got better.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Mahan Van Wee, and I live in Johnstown now, but I'm here to talk about my mother, Anne, when she came to this area and went to work in a glove mill. It started because we left New Jersey. My father wanted a farm, so we left New Jersey and moved to a farm in Glen. And at that time, we had 6 children, and my youngest sister was quite ill with a heart condition. And when my sister passed away, her name was Patty, when she passed away, my mother said, "I'm so tired of being poor out on this farm," that she said, "I think I'll find a job." So she went down to Fultonville and she found a job working in one of the really small shops and started sewing gloves. Her assignment was thumbs. Now my mother was a sewer, but she hadn't sewed in years because she was raising 6 children. When she got to the glove mill, the people that were the most welcoming and supportive were the Italian immigrant women, and I'm still moved by the fact that they were so kind to my mother as a newcomer walking into that shop. She worked on those thumbs and said, "This is not easy putting thumbs in," but she did it, and it was really what she profited was her self-esteem, that she would have money to buy extras because the farm wasn't profitable, and then she could buy extra for us. And I remember the gift that I received after my mother started working on the gloves was, I was going on my senior trip and she bought me a nice raincoat and a very nice suitcase, and I thought that was so sweet of her. I don't know what my brothers and sisters got from her sewing the gloves, but I really appreciated that. She was smart and very motivated and never stopped after that.
My name is Sandy Fessinger. I am a longtime Johnstown resident, and I'm going to be talking about my mother's mother, my grandmother Julia Zilka, who was a hand closer at LF Swears Incorporated that used to be located on North Perry Street in Johnstown, New York. My grandmother grew up in Slovakia and pretty much was a peasant girl. I don't even think she had shoes, but that we'll talk about in a bit. But my grandmother, her mother died 2 weeks after she was born in 1898. And my grandfather, well, it would be her father, so my great-grandfather came to the United States first, and then my grandmother's oldest sister came next, then the middle sister, and then my grandmother came over in I'm going to say the early 20s. She was born, as I said, in 1898, so she was probably 22 when she came to the United States. She did not have to pass through Ellis Island per se because her family was already there. She ended up, it's kind of funny, she ended up in Gloversville, New York, and she was a housekeeper and cook, and met my grandfather, Joseph, and they were married and started their family in 1925. So the Zilka family had farmland, and my grandmother was a homemaker. My grandfather passed away in 1949 at the age of 49, and my mother, Teresa Sweet, kind of looked out for my grandmother, and she later got a job with Swears' Gloves as a hand closer. My grandmother would walk to work, and she would walk home from work, and especially, here comes the shoe part, I could hear her. As I mentioned, my grandmother didn't have shoes when she was little, and her feet were very wide. So Lou Martz carried Triple E shoes, and if people remember the shoes that older women wore in the 50s, they were kind of big clunky heels, tie, and so on. So I could hear my grandmother as she left the house walk down the driveway, because my bedroom window was on the driveway side of the house, and I could hear the clip, 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 clip down the driveway. And then as she turned on Fisher Avenue to head towards Miller Street, I could hear the clip, clip, clip until finally it faded out of earshot. And talking with my dad the other day, he grew up on North Perry, near Crescendo Road, which was once called Beaver Street. And the Brunetto family was on Beaver Street, and Mrs. Brunetto was a hand closer as well. And the neighborhood kids would go, and my father said it was kind of easy. It was a loop, and you looped through, and you closed the fingers on these knit gloves. And then on Sundays, they couldn't wait because Mrs. Brunetto made a big pot of pasta, and all the kids would come who helped her for that week. And my dad especially remembers that she made pasta and peas, and he thought that was really kind of neat.
Yes, good morning, Anya. It's nice to be with you, a fellow board member of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Hometown Association, and to participate in this particular project, which certainly focuses on the women of Fulton County and the glove industry. So I thank you for inviting me to do this. And I'm going to tell you about my aunt, Irma Evangelista Conway, who was a designer of gloves for the Myers Make Company in Gloversville, New York, on Pine Street and South Main Street. It was a large 3-story, I believe, building. I remember it being there, and I remember people still working in it when I was a kid. And my aunt worked outside of the home in this factory setting her entire life as a designer. In fact, I and my cousin, her granddaughter, have many of her designs. And she would go to New York City in the spring and fall and just to see what the colors were going to be of fashions for the upcoming seasons. And then she would draw designs accordingly and recommend colors for the gloves as well. And when she then went to work, now she's an older woman, she's going into her 60s, she went to work for a glove manufacturer in Fonda, New York. And I think it was called Fonda Manufacturing. Of course, it's no longer in business. And there she worked for a few years. And it culminated in her, I think, either retiring or perhaps having trouble getting to work because she did not drive, and my uncle would have driven her, had to drive her to work. And in any case, when she left, she expected to get her design book back. And the people that she worked for, the management, would not give her her design book. And she could not afford an attorney to fight to get that back, to claim it. So that was the end of that. Basically for her, and she was very bitter and sad that she had been so poorly treated. She certainly was a major part of the household income for all of her life. My aunt had a memory of being proud of her work. She told her granddaughter that one of her designs was chosen to appear in the lobby of the Glove Theater, and it was inspired by a film starring Irma's favorite actress, Betty Davis. And so that was, one of the high points in terms of her designing and knowing for whom she was designing.
The glove and leather industry slowly began to evolve as women's roles evolved. This next story, we believe, was when the glass ceiling was broken in Fulton County.
Hi, my name is Jeannie So, and I'm
a prior tannery president, very involved with the leather industry. And I guess my story began back in 1975-76 when I had, after having my third child, gone back to work briefly at the Rainbow restaurant where all of the tanners would eat lunch. And I was a part-time employee, hoping not to be there too long. My husband was between jobs, and so I had to go to work. A prior boss, who was at that time a tannery owner, came in for lunch, as many of them did, and begged me to come to work because his payroll clerk, who had been in the tannery since the 40s, was retiring. This was a man. So I reluctantly agreed, but only on the premise that it would be part-time and until he found someone. So off to work I went in a tannery environment, but the office was across the tannery, separated by a driveway. So I wasn't really in the tannery. A few months into my employment, which was interesting because I had to learn antiquated machines to do payroll. Everything was piecework in the leather industry. The office manager, who was a woman, and the first woman to ever have been hired by the tannery, got in a squabble with the owner and walked off the job. So here I am, part-time, and the owner, Mr. Fred Rulison, and the tannery was the F. Rulison and Sons Tannery on Charles Street in Johnstown, begged me to stay until he could find someone to do the billing and other chores that this person did. Well, we didn't find anyone, and I ended up staying. So I went from part-time to full-time, and over the years learned the process of tanning, the leather industry, and how difficult it was going to be for a woman to be in the position that I ended up in. So over the years, I progressed from the office manager on up through until ultimately the president of the tannery, as the owner had other business interests here and also in Panama. So once I learned the industry, I became president. But the traveling to that position was interesting. I was definitely in a man's world. There was no question about that. My peer group were men. They were not accepting. The employees were not necessarily accepting. This was a good old boys world. And for a woman to walk into a tannery was a unique and different experience for them, and it certainly was unique and different for me. Going into the tannery took me a while, but as I progressed in my position, I can remember the first time that I had to go was to sign up our new insurance carrier. And what I saw in the tannery broadened my education, would be a very polite way to say it, because in those days, gentlemen hung up pinup girls and various other things, because this was, since the early 40s, a man's world. And I had to have a little chat with myself that if I was going to continue in this position, that I would have to accept certain things that were outside my comfort level. So I did, and the men eventually became used to me and started to take their orders from me, not without difficult times. There was one incident that I recall where the owner was in town and he decided he would walk through the tannery and see how things were going. And he saw a pile of leather that he wanted removed from the area it was in, and he told me about that. And on a few days later, he was leaving town and he came to take another walk through, and of course we had meetings, and that pile was still there. And he said to me, "I thought I told you to clean that area." And I said, well, I followed that order. And he said, if you're going to be ineffective in your position, perhaps we have a problem. Needless to say, that pile of leather was moved very rapidly thereafter, and I think my skin got a little tougher and I became a little bit more forceful. But I wasn't quite ready for the part with the tannery owners. And back in the 70s, this was the latter part of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, there was an outfit called the Rainbow Alliance. And rightfully so, they were upset with the environmental issues of the tannery, especially in the creek that ran down through Gloversville and Johnstown. So this necessitated the tannery workers to get together, to have a plan, to have a defense, to have the next step. So I found myself meeting with other tannery owners. Well, I wasn't prepared for that either, and they weren't prepared for a woman to be in their midst. There never had been any females in management in tanneries prior, and there was quite an uprising. It was not pleasant for me. Thankfully, the first meeting, the owner accompanied me. He must have known that he would be needed. And he had to stand up in the middle of the meeting and tell the other tannery owners that I had every right to be there as much as they did, and that I would be there and I would continue to be there, and I was the corporate president and I would be representing our interests in the environmental problem. It took a little while, but eventually I did gain the respect of the other owners. But it was very difficult, and I think the point needs to be made that women really had to work twice as hard to gain any recognition, to do their job, and we always had to do our job a bit better, or we'd be called on the carpet for that. And as I speak of women, the tannery did not have any women employees. The first employee, as I mentioned earlier, was in the office. But as I gained knowledge of the industry and as I became much more involved in the day-to-day production, I did see where women could do some of the tasks. Certainly not the raw end, which we were a raw to finished tannery, which means that the hides came in their natural state and they went out the door in their completed state. So the first floor was what we'd call the wet floor, and the second floor was the dry floor. And there were measuring machines, 2 of them that we had. And I noticed that women certainly could be doing that. And it was probably the late 70s, the beginning of the 80s, and women were entering the workforce much more prevalently than they had previously. So I decided I was going to try to get women involved in this venture. And knowing that I would meet up with opposition from this all-male environment, I started out with the wife of one of our supervisors who was a cousin to the owner. This was a Rulison, and I figured if I was going to get any acceptance at all, I might have to lower my thought process and jump in with a relative, which I did. And there was a lot of complaining, a lot of false accusations of her inability to keep up. I purposely observed. I would be found there at all hours watching. And she certainly did keep up. She did every bit as good a job as those men. So once that was tackled, I brought in a second woman for the second machine. And again, I stayed with the cousins and another Rulison woman. And after a while, that did not work out. She had some outside issues and had to leave her employment. But I was not going to give up that position that I had created for a woman. So I went to a friend who had 3 children and was not in an employment situation where she was making enough money. And I offered her the job, gave her a tour, and she said, absolutely, I can do this. And she turned out to be one of the best employees that we ever had. And she certainly kept her end, outworked the men in many cases. So I was present during the time frame when women were not in the actual manufacturer of leather. That has changed since now. I was present during the time when women were not in management, and I had to go through all of that. I did a lot of learning. Bringing women into the leather industry was probably a lot different than bringing them anywhere else. They were already in offices, but not inside plants that would be manufacturing. The responsibilities that I had over that period of time started out with basic payroll and moved up to office work, and from there became involved in the brokerage of the hides. Most of the hides came from France, where people were still eating horse meat. We manufactured horse hides from raw to finish. Our end product was baseball leather. We also made cordovan leather for men's cordovan shoes, and we also made safety leather. One of our customers for the safety leather was local, Francis Sutton on Perry Street, and he in fact eventually brought women in to help with the sewing of the gloves. So I was seeing during my time frame an increase of women coming into the industry itself. There always were women in the glove manufacturing, but not in the manufacturing of the actual leather. My responsibilities continued to grow as I became corporate president. I would meet with all of our customers, the major sporting goods manufacturers. That would be Lanham and Rawlings, all of the major manufacturers who made baseball. Baseballs were actually made in Haiti. They brought the leather in from our factory. We were very busy. We didn't have 24-hour shifts, but we did work Monday through Friday with Saturdays reserved for extra loads if we needed to provide extra leather. When it was time for World Series and different things, there were extra balls needed. But it was a very difficult but rewarding time for a woman in the leather industry.
Well, I'm Sandy Mazeka. My father owned a leather mill, Crown Finishing and Marenco Tanning, and he worked for several companies before he started his own business. So I can tell you a little bit about his business. He did garment leather, finished garment leather for coats, and people in New York made the coats and sold them. So he had a lot of customers in New York City. I don't know. He didn't do deer leather, which some of the people around here did, and made garments. Iranian sheep. You can't get Iranian sheep anymore. There is no Iran. But he did they sent over barrels of sheepskin from Iran, and they sent Argentinian cow were the two that I remember. I think there were probably others, but those are the main two that I remember. Well, when my father started his business, we used to go and help him with the leather process, and we'd pull skins out of the drums and hang them on hooks and swab them with colors.
The history of Fulton County is so strongly tied to the glove and leather industry, and the women who worked there helped provide for their families and also gained confidence in themselves, which they then passed on to their daughters and granddaughters.
My name is Anna Cook.
Anna, hi Anna.
Hi.
And I'm Ruth Levinton, and we're here to talk about Anna's history in the glove industry, and it goes back quite a ways. So where did your grandmother and your mother come from?
Naples, Italy.
Naples, and they settled in Gloversville, right? And your grandmother and your mother had a room that she
used to teach gloves.
And she had a bunch of sewing machines, right?
All kinds.
So you grew up with the sewing machines.
Right.
And how old do you think you were when you learned to sew gloves?
17.
Oh, yeah.
I can remember coming home from school, and my mother would say, get your housework done, and I'd do my housework. And then she'd say, okay, now sit at the machine. And I'd cry and cry because I didn't want to learn how to sew gloves. And I says, Mom, I want to go to school. She says, well, you're not going to school, so make up your mind that you're going to sew gloves. So I learned how to sew gloves. My tears would run down my face, and my mother didn't care. She says, keep on going, and things cleared up. I used to sew the thumb on the glove.
Oh.
And the PK thumb had double stitching all the way around, and it had to be even.
Yeah.
If it was crooked, you'd get it back, and you had to straighten it out. And I also sewed the wool on the leather on a wool glove, which is called palming.
Oh, yeah.
I did that too.
Yeah. And which factories, which companies did you work for?
I worked for Conroy's in Johnstown. I worked for Rubens in Gloversville, Papa's in Gloversville, ProTech in Gloversville.
So they're all gone now.
Non-existing.
No. And I think you were saying that you walked to work in a lot of those factories. A lot of women did walk to work all together. You'd like meet each other.
Yep.
Yeah. And
everybody knew everybody.
Yeah. And they were from all over the world probably too, right?
Yep.
You had immigrants from a lot of places.
And when we worked at Papa's, it was like one big happy family.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, they'd put on a party, and we'd have a good time. And
that's good.
Send for food, and we'd
Yeah.
eat, and it was just wonderful. It really
Yeah.
was. I didn't mind working in the glove shops at all. Papa's, we learned how to do the government glove.
And what was that?
It was a government glove. It was leather sewed on fabric, and it was a big long glove.
Oh.
And you sewed the fabric onto the leather, and it had to be good because it was government, and it got inspected all the time.
Where were those gloves going? Were they going to go into the armed?
The services.
Oh, they were. So you were working through the wars probably too, right? And so they were, so that's where they were going. Yeah.
And to this day, if I'm watching television, I'll see a pilot, and he's got the gloves on.
Really?
Yeah.
That
And it was a gray glove with khaki leather, khaki material.
Yeah.
And it just worked out good for service. It all had to be government inspected and everything. Stitches had to be so much apart. If they were more than that, you take them back and you got to sew them again.
Wow, that's really good.
Yeah.
So that must give you like a nice feeling when you see them.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, to put a glove down and say, "Oh, I did that," you know.
Yeah.
It is. It's a good feeling.
When you do it. And your granddaughter is back in the leather industry, right?
I know, that amazed me when I knew she was going to work for Townsend Leather. I said,
know.
"Oh, that's wonderful."
It comes full circle.
And she likes it besides.
Stedding. I'm 30. I currently reside in Johnstown, New York, but I was born and raised in Gloversville. I work at Townsend Leather, where I've been for about 6 years now, a little over, and I'm in their product development and sales. I went to school at the Fashion Institute of Technology for production management. So when I found my way back home to Gloversville, I wasn't sure exactly where I was going to land or what I was going to do, and I was like, well, let's go back to the roots of what this area is all about, which is leather making. So I scoped out a few of the local leather companies and landed at Townsend, and very happily so. They're a great company and awesome people to work for. So as I evolved into that, I have grown from customer service and now into basically making and selling my own leather products, which is an absolute pleasure to do. But going back a bit into the roots of my own family, my great-grandparents came here from Italy, and they were in the leather making of this region. So they were learning the trade and teaching the trade as well. I don't know too much about the specifics of that, but I know that my grandmother followed in their footsteps and worked in the glove making industry. So she spent her time in the glove factories, and I remember going there as a little girl And seeing all the ladies doing the glove working and just the community that they built together was so inspiring. I think a lot of them were immigrants and didn't have too many friends or family here, and found, you know, it helpful to all work together and kind of create their own community together. So I remember my grandmother having her sewing machine at home and working on her gloves at home as well. So that was always special to see, and I know that she had a lot of passion for it. And now me and my mother both work at Townsend, so carrying on those roots and continuing to work in the industry that this area is so well known for. I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity for women in the leather making industry. I know that myself and Sarah Eckler and Trisha Martin at Townsend, we're all very proud to be women running this industry. I think it was predominantly males for a very long time, so being a younger woman in this industry has certainly been an interesting feat, but one I'm definitely proud of to take on, and to, you know, learn this craftsmanship is really special and important. Leather is such a beautiful natural material. There's a lot of heart that goes into it and pride behind it. So every day walking through the factory and seeing our workers, you know, put their efforts and their love into this product makes it all the more of a reason why I love what I do. There's something so special about working on the product development side of things, and, you know, taking an idea and making it a reality and working alongside such wonderful people to make it all happen is really special. And then being able to go on and sell that product to really wonderful people and seeing it displayed in hotel lobbies or aircraft seating or on footwear is just very fulfilling.
So from starting working in your kitchen, living room, wherever you could find a space for your sewing machine, to running now today an entire company in the industry, women have always been a part of the glove and leather manufacturing, and I think as long as we have it in Fulton County, we'll continue to see that.
Hi, I'm Sarah Eckler.
And I'm Trisha Martin.
Our maiden name is Cusel. We're two of the three Cusel sisters, and Cusel is the family name of the owners and operators of Townsend Leather, a company that's been in business for 53 years now.
Yeah, and I'd like to say our story begins as young children growing up with a family of leather makers. We'd often talk about different garments and leather types at the dinner table.
You couldn't go to a shoe store without our dad touching shoes to see if they were made out of real leather, or suitcases, all of that.
So I would say in the early 90s, we began working right alongside the machinery at Townsend. We worked in many different departments as teens and summer breaks, from staking machine to actually sorting the hides, to watching the color being sprayed, to getting sample packages together, working right alongside our mom and a couple of our aunts in the office as well.
Yeah, and I'd say at that time we probably did not see ourselves doing this as a career. It was something, our parents worked very hard and they spent a lot of hours at work, so to kind of see us more and to teach us a good work ethic, they had us start working very young. But I would say, at least for myself, I did not see myself working at Townsend Leather until I got older.
Yeah, I was a little bit more sure. I knew I wanted to do something in the business world, but I didn't know if it was exactly in the family business. So I did end up going to school for business management and marketing. Also had an interest in finance, but ultimately I loved being around the people that I saw working with my family.
So I've been at Townsend 21 years now. I'm the older sister, but I think you beat me by a year officially.
Yeah, 22 years.
And plus those teenage years. Let's backtrack a little bit, though, and tell them our whole family story. Our grandfather, Albert Red was his nickname, Cusel, started Townsend Leather in 1969. Our dad was in college then, going to Delhi, but driving home often to help his dad with the company. But in the 70s and 80s, our business looked very different than it does today, right, Trish?
Yeah, they primarily made leather for garments, so gloves and aprons. They ran probably 1,000,000 square feet a week, which is a lot of leather, and we don't do that probably in a month right now.
Yeah, and it was like black or brown, very basic colors. So large runs, very commodity based. And
80s?
around the 80s, things got a little rough around here, as many people in Fulton County can share that. There's a lot more competition from Asia and overseas. So they really had to find more of a niche business. And later on that, in the early 80s, my grandfather, who used to race horses at Saratoga in his spare time, living in Mico, he was sadly and tragically killed by a horse. He had them at his house. He went to see them at the end of a workday, and the mother of the new horse, got threatened, kicked him in the heart, and he passed away before he even got to the hospital. So guess what? My dad was now running the business. There was no succession plan. It was very tough back then. They were close to bankruptcy. They needed a whole new business model. So our dad, at that time, took over and kind of, with our mom and some of our other family members, including many aunts and a couple uncles, helped reinvent Townsend. But that lesson that Dad learned was that he was going to be very purposeful about making sure that he had a succession plan and an exit strategy.
Yeah. And around that same time, he reinvented the business by finding a niche market, finding success in making custom colors and finishes for business and corporate aircrafts, head of state aircrafts, working long nights with just a few family members, developing colors matching to things never before, like paint chips, with special pearlized effects on it. And he landed the first few OEMs, and that kind of started where we are now.
So the 90s was that decade when we reinvented ourselves. We would say like Madonna. And, that was fun for color too, I think, because they would tell a customer at that time, send us anything and we'll match to it, whether it's a piece of carpet or thread. But I mean, we've matched to green Granny Smith apples, little
Coke bottles,
anything that people can send you. So, but at that time we were very much still making what our customers asked us to make. So when we joined in the early 2000s, it was more because our dad kind of got us interested because he wanted to become more of a marketing company. He was quite impressed with Ralph Lauren at the time, who was doing a lot of lifestyle marketing. So he really wanted to create our own color lines around themes and collections. So that's the era we got involved in. It was fun.
Yeah, not only the storytelling was fun and the marketing side, which I think you gravitated to, but I really gravitated to what my mom did, and she was in the office doing customer service. So we became stronger by having one of the best customer services around. We were able to present samples overnight to presentations. I still remember the day my mom said, you make sure you treat everyone you talk to like they're a customer, whether it's an employee or a supplier or the FedEx guy. And the story is asking the FedEx guy to hang out a little bit longer because we had one more package that had to go and they were still preparing it. And because he hung out, she made sure she baked him cookies. And the next day, she was chasing him down the road, making sure his family had those cookies for the extra special wait he did for us. So I just grew to love that aspect about the company and the people that fulfilled it.
Both our husbands joined the business around that time. Our dad said, your boyfriends have to have a job. So they kind of joined it for fun, but they both spent decades in the business. My husband's our president now. Trisha's husband, Jeff, ran production for 2 decades.
Yeah.
And they were both impressed with our parents. They decided to stay at the company too because they saw how generous our parents were, how they took care of the employees. Growing up, we saw my mom buying gifts for, Chris on the spray line and his new children, that kind of thing, the family feel. And my husband always will tell my mom that what struck him the most, and it's a habit he's adopted now as president, she would handwrite thank you notes and anniversary cards or new baby cards or that kind of thing to each and every employee. So my husband Jared still writes, whether it's a first anniversary, a 25th anniversary, a 6th anniversary, second, whatever, a personalized thank you note. That's not just like, good job. It's, this is what you did this year. This is the department you worked in. This is why it mattered. This is what makes you special. So
I still love to get them in the mail. So another important aspect about what made us stay with the company is the culture. Believing in the people and making sure that they feel fulfilled and happy in life. Our mom and dad always said to us, like, that's what it's all about. It's for the well-being of your people. And we don't just call them employees or people or coworkers. We actually refer to them as partners because they are our partners. They are everything to us. With that being said, my parents taught us to always provide other forms of engagement with them. So we do events, we'll do races, 5K races together. We'll do community service together where we go out and clean up the rail trail. We do
bake-offs, chili cook-offs, outside events, like our cabin fever party that we always do in the winter.
Yeah, that's a big hit.
And dance and have fun together.
We adopt children at Christmas time, so many things, but it brings us together in a different way, and I love the culture that it creates. We honestly all feel like we're family, a giant family there.
We have a mission statement, and that's also tied to many of our values, such as flexibility, teamwork, communication, and some fun ones like Joe Cool and Jane Cool. And so at the end of the year, we vote in all these different categories for our partners, and we award them throughout the year, and we kind of call them our superlatives. So those are really fun and a way to, recognize people more in real time for how they're contributing. I also want to say, I'm really proud to see in our generation how many more women are working at Townsend. Definitely way more than when we first started. Yeah. I think there was a lot of connotation with leather mills as it being something that only men could do. And whether being on the floor or being run, it was definitely a male-dominated industry when we were born and growing up.
Proud to say now at Townsend, I think we're 40% women, 60% men, hoping to increase that percentage too.
To 51% women and 49% men.
But just over the last 2 years, an example of that is the leadership team below the senior leadership team is now primarily women. We have a group of 3 to 4 women who schedule all our production, take care of personnel issues, deal with the day-to-day, and that's a huge change. We did not see that 20 years ago when we started.
There's women right out on machines too, our staking machine, our vac dryer, our hand tipping department, our trimming, QC lab is all women, HR is women, our sample department is all women and one man. Mm-hmm. I'm the senior VP of sales and marketing, overseeing a sales staff of both women and men.
And I'm a senior VP of customer service where I lead about 11 women.
Women are, our dad always told us that women could do whatever we wanted as long as we worked hard. And he had more confidence in us, I think, than we even did, that we were going to be good at marketing or going to be good at customer service and that we knew more than our customers. So share what you know. And if you don't know, you can come back and get the answers. So I think he helped us grow. And it's very important for us to continue empowering the women on our team. We have a lot of women that have been there for decades, but we have a lot of women in their early 20s that we're privileged to help grow. Want to tell them about your March event that you put on every year around Women's Equality Day?
Sure. So for the past 2 years on March 8th, it's International Women's Day, and we pick a seminar on, popular topics that affect us women, and we get probably 60 women in a room, and we just we let them stay on the clock, but we have a time where we come together and we discuss current issues, dreams and hopes, and it's a really impactful event where I think everyone gets to be heard and can be honest in the room with each other, and there's a comfort level.
Yeah, I really love doing that. We've the last couple of years we found inspirational quotes, and then we put them in like a little leather wristlet that some of our leather is made on, and at the end we all pick them and we read the quote and say if it's fitting or not, and 9 out of 10 times that resonates with each woman. So it's definitely something we're proud of, that we are helping to run the company today as women, and holding strong to our mother's example of customer service, and we're really excited about the future of Townsend.
Yep. We hope we can continue to provide women a safe and comfortable place to keep working and still being mothers and still being...
Men too. We'll let men have that too.
Yeah, we'll let men too. Just being comfortable and being themselves and finding their best selves.
So if you are looking for an indisputable story of women's equality, look no further than Fulton County, New York. Not only is our first daughter, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the first women in America to call for a woman's right to vote, but just look at the women who have worked and are still working in the leather and glove industries.
Women have gone from sewing gloves in their own kitchens and walking to work in glove factories to keep food on their table and elevating their families to the middle class, to owning a global leather company right here in our county.
So today it is our privilege to shine a light on the work ethic, the dedication, the creativity, and the chutzpah of the industrious women of Fulton County. We are so proud of you.